Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast, where we talk with interesting people about interesting things, in particular, building enduring great companies. And this is episode 6 out of 7 episodes introducing our new book, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better, Avoiding the Pressure for Endless Growth to Build a Better Business and Life. Today, as with this series, I'm joined by Andreas and Richard. How are you today, chaps?
Good. Thank you for having us again.
Yes, and again, welcome from sunny Sydney today. Beautiful day.
Lovely to hear. So today's Better Financials, we started off talking about the problem or the difference between bigger and better. And we talked about how do we get into this situation in the next episode, the different ways the pressure for bigger impacts us. We went on to better team, better customer, and better offering. And now we're talking about better financials. And then next week, we're talking about a better life by design. But you can only have a better life by design, designing the kind of life that you really want, when you've organized or sorted out your financials. So I'll probably just start by again introducing the concept of drift that we've spoken about before. Obviously, I'd encourage, if you haven't listened, to listen to the preceding episodes. But drift is where teams drift toward toxicity, customers drift towards indifference, offerings drift towards mediocrity, financials drift towards unprofitability. And so we're obviously talking about financials today in that context. So would you like to kick it off?
So maybe explain, Brad, a little bit more. You mentioned the financials drift towards unprofitability. So what does it look like in practice? What are the symptoms perhaps that people so they can understand a little bit better what's that about?
Yeah. So a business is dynamic. It's never in a steady state. So I want you to think back to the years following the COVID pandemic, when we had inflation take off. So for many people, if they didn't have high levels of financial discipline, they might only notice those cost increases hitting their financials after the end of month or end of quarter, or when their accountant told them. And then when they looked at it, they would be like, well, this line item went up so much and that line item went up so much. I remember this particular image that illustrated inflation, where it had 2 photos in the same lumber yard in America, and how much could you buy with $100? I think it was how much lumber or timber could you buy? Now the first photo was pre-pandemic, and the next one was at that point in time, and it was about half or less than half the same amount of timber. Financials drift in a company where you keep your price the same, let's say, or the price of your goods or services stays the same, but things are happening like rent is going up or electricity is going up. But it's also in other ways that are off balance sheet and off P&L. For example, we may introduce new meetings that are ineffective, or we might incur other types of things that aren't necessarily making us as a team as effective as possible, that are all of these things working toward eroding the final profit of the company. So we've got to work against that.
That kind of leads to an interesting sort of follow-up to that. So as you are faced with these issues, these changes in the business and so on, but if we have those and then the business is just growing and getting bigger, aren't we able to account for those? Aren't we able to deal with that?
We are able to account for those. And I always kind of think, and in the book talk about the difference between a company and a corporation. And I think that's where you're heading, Rich, is that in a corporation, it's actually not so much of a problem, because you do what you're told. So in owner-led companies, it's easy to spend, whereas in a corporation, it's hard to spend. And to take a corporation even further away from that, imagine if you worked for the government and you spent $5,000 more than you were supposed to. It would be a major problem, and you'd have to sit in days and days of meetings. Now, it could have been for a good purpose, but if you weren't allowed to spend it, if it was outside of what you were allocated, it'd be a problem. And it's quite similar in a corporation. But this problem isn't present in any sense in a owner-led company, especially undisciplined owner-led companies that are driven by impulsive risk takers. So yeah, the freedom that an owner-led company has, as we've discussed in the other episodes, plays up in a financial sense in that it accelerates that drift toward unprofitability because all of the discipline in a corporation isn't there. All of the discipline. If we think, you know what, we should go and buy some new chairs for the office because I read an article that says that new chairs are going to improve employee morale, and we go and spend $30,000 doing that, well, there's no one stopping us to do that, even though it might not have been on our projections or budget or thinking.
So are we saying that there's a problem with money in owner-led businesses, or are we really going back to kind of where we started with, which is that this impulsive risk taker accelerates the bad use of money? So money is in itself is not the problem, but it's the bad use of money. Is that what we're getting at this point?
Think it's a book about mindset, right? And so the bad use of money comes about because the absence of the right kind of mindset, understanding the purpose of money in that sense. Now, going back to that preceding story about COVID, if we were a corporation that had much higher levels of financial discipline and also the way that we think about money in a corporation, it would be quite different. And what we would do is we would address that much, much, much quicker. So rather than, let's say, if we're in an inflationary environment, changing pricing once a year or once every 2 years when we basically discovered that we were unprofitable, they would be addressing it as soon as the pricing changes came in, because the pricing changes would denote a budget variance that needed to be addressed.
So yeah, I think it speaks to this issue that it's all about the discipline and the timeliness of thinking about the use of money rather than money is in itself a problem, right?
Yeah.
And going back to that discipline, Richard, that you're mentioning, we previously spoke about these undisciplined risk takers or impulsive risk takers, pardon me, where we have these 2x2 people who lack discipline and people who lack patience. So, Brad, if you were to expand on how being an impulsive risk taker, and what are the steps that actually can trap owners in that space when they're chasing growth for growth's sake from a financial or better financials point of view?
Yeah, it plays into, in a sense, the way that we think about money that we're going to talk about later in this episode. But if you're enamored with bigger, if you think that bigger is the answer and that bigger is the goal, what you can do is you can think equally when we don't have that discipline. We've spoken about corporations. You can think about, well, if I think that I want money to be the goal, if I think that I want to be bigger, we need to make disciplines, we need to make investments, but those investments to grow bigger are undisciplined. Okay. So they come about, like I said, because someone says that, well, I heard that it's good for employee morale if we buy, $5,000 chairs or whatever it might be. Things pop up and we go and spend money on them in a completely undisciplined way. So if we have the doom loop is again what we call it, and how the bigger financials doom loop works is it starts with this undisciplined investment to grow bigger. I think that many of the listeners have have seen this and probably done it themselves. I know that I have, but we just think, okay, yeah, let's go for that. Again, driven by an impulsive risk taker, impatient and undisciplined. And so when that happens, because of the lack of discipline, they tend to generally have an undisciplined management of their business and their new investments. So that means that what happens, we can't help but generate poor business returns because it's not managed well. It's not managed in the right kind of way. Because we have a better mindset, because we don't have a bigger mindset, because we have a bigger mindset, I'll get it right one day, when we've got those poor business returns, what happens? We react without understanding. And then when that happens, we think to solve that problem, or I'm not worried about that problem anymore, I need to bring in a new idea. And then that new idea is typically an undisciplined investment to grow bigger, taking us back to the 12 o'clock point of the doom loop. So we've completed the first cycle. So again, undisciplined investment to grow bigger. We manage that in not the best way. That generates poor results. We react without understanding. We think that then we need to come up with a new idea to become bigger. And then we have an undisciplined investment back into that.
Interestingly, a couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation with the owner of a business, and this business they've been growing, as the owner mentioned. And he said, yeah, over the last 2 years, we've been expanding in different geographies, different products. And I said, well, okay, great. So how's your profitability? And he said, well, we're still working on that, which is probably reflecting that feeling of, yeah, we're not there, but I think expanding is easier or comes first. That was his idea, which probably leads to another question that I wanted to ask Brad. And then obviously, Richard, to have your input as well. Brad, you mentioned that the problem is not how much we invest, but the real issue is how easy it is then to spend. And you mentioned this before, so can you expand on what is the difference between the money as a goal and money as a resource?
Yeah. It's a subtle difference, but if we think about, or our mindset towards money is that it is a goal. So I need to get to 50 million in revenue, or I need to have a $5 million house, or I need to have a net worth of whatever it is. We slip into this mindset that bigger is better. And so when we have that bigger is better mindset relative to money as a goal, what it means is that everything, we're not working to compound our money. Instead, what we're advocating is to treat money as a resource so that it can build lasting value. It's quite subtle, but we kind of elaborate in the book. But if money is a goal, then we need to get that money to achieve that goal. And when you overlay that with a lack of discipline, we can think everything that we do along that path is worthy of effort. Equally and opposite, when we treat it as a resource, it changes the dynamic, because then that resource has to create an appropriate return. And so then going back to the chairs example, okay, what is going to be the return of that $25,000 that we're going to spend on chairs? Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't invest in culture. I've spoken and written about that a lot. What I'm saying is, okay, so if we spend $25,000 in chairs rather than $5,000, what's going to be the return that we're going to get for that? So applying that, because money is a resource, it needs to compound.
Yeah, and it reminds me, we've talked in this podcast, but also in previous episodes about this idea, which was raised by Greg Crabtree, this idea of labor efficiency and labor productivity. And I think it's a great way of sort of illustrating the point you just made. You know, I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, oh, well, we want to add another salesperson because the last one was amazing. And, we're growing. We've got more deals, more contracts. And fantastic. Okay, so how are we going to evaluate that investment? To treat money as a resource, not as just a decision. And they sort of looked at me blankly. I said, well, what if we know that the average salesperson you have now is giving you $5 of gross margin for every dollar of cost you're investing in them in terms of salary? So we should at least expect that as the net return for that next person. And we went down this path of, but maybe we shouldn't have the same expectation. And you could see this sort of impulsive risk, a lack of discipline to judging the use of money as a resource. And I said, so if you're going to let the money produce 3 or 4, you're saying that you would wish to be less productive and less profitable by hiring somebody. Is that what you really meant to say? And it was just really interesting to see that come to play out to illustrate your point.
Yeah, it does play out in that way, but it does also come from that mindset and thinking about the way that money serves its master. Is it to help me to get to some goal that I just made up, like 50 million or 2 million or whatever the thing is? Or is it to say the purpose of money when serving its master is to turn one $100 into 120 and then turn that $120 into 144 or whatever it is over and over and over and over again, to keep compounding.
Yeah, and I think, sort of taking that idea of compounding and that idea of patience versus impatience, there's a great quote in the book from Clayton Christensen, and it's one of my favorite quotes I've used, I don't know how many times, being patient for growth and impatient for profit. And I'm struck every time I say that to somebody and they think I've got it wrong. They think I've got the order wrong or the emphasis wrong. I wonder about your thoughts on that.
Well, that really speaks to, it appears a few times in the book intentionally, because it really simply speaks to the difference between an owner-led company and a corporation slash startup. Now, Facebook is a corporation. Okay. Now, when we think about the way that corporations act, we think, yeah, but they went for that company when it grew, and any particular story, they went for market share. They were like, we'll worry about profit later. So we think if they're so successful, whatever company it could be, Facebook or whoever, and in the software as a service or the software world, they were so successful, then there must be something in that. So I've got to push for growth. But it also speaks to the other components of people who think that bigger is better, and why, in the episode where we spoke about the pressure for bigger, why that matters. So that's all good and well, but we aren't talking about in this book venture capital backed companies necessarily. We're talking about people who need to survive. They're not necessarily looking for a quick exit. They're looking to build the right kind of sustainable business. So growth is, if you're impatient for growth and patient for profits, that's all good and well until your burn rate catches up with you, or until such time as there's an event that changes your trajectory, like a competitor comes along with a better offering, or a competitor starts to encroach on your territory, or whatever it might be. So the profits today give you stability, and it speaks very strongly to this concept of money as a resource.
Yeah, it triggers just a quick thought for me, which was a company I was working with recently who had been relying on other people's money, as I call it, other
Yep.
sources of money. And they've been using that, plus, trying to run a better and better business, but they'd become a little bit too to what that source was. But it became really quite interesting when that other people's money source had new rules and then started to slow down in terms of its injection. And luckily, that allowed us to have a much better conversation about how do we drive not just recurring revenues, but how do we drive recurring profit. And as soon as we started to do that, the other people's money became useful as and when needed, but it was an investment decision now, not just a way to make the business bigger. So yeah, no, it really does drive home that thought.
Also, it brings the different components that we discuss with clients all the time when they are very curious about growing and they want to expand geographies or products. And we bring back to the conversation, so what about the recurring, as you mentioned, Richard, that recurring profitability? But it's not there yet. So how much cash do we still have to cover for that? Well, maybe it will last for maybe a couple of years or maybe a couple of months. And then how much can we borrow? And then bring back, well, how much can we repay of that borrowing? And as you mentioned, Brad, this creates a doom loop if we don't pay attention to all of these elements at once, at the same time. So I find that really exciting on a coach point of view, but it's really stressful from the owner point of view, right?
Oh, it is. It is. And it really speaks to, one of my favorite points in the book, which is the strategic investor matrix. And I say that because it's interesting for me over time to think, where have I sat across these different classifications? So I'll quickly explain that then. The 2x2, the horizontal axis is discipline. So we've got low financial discipline and high financial discipline. And then the vertical axis is money as a goal, as we discussed before, or money as a resource. So how do you view, what's your mindset or the way that you look toward goals? So in the bottom left corner, we've got low financial discipline and treating money as a goal. And what we have there is the busy owner. Then above that, we have low financial discipline and treating money as a resource. And that is the cash poor entrepreneur. Then in the bottom right corner, we've got high financial discipline and treating money as a goal. And this is the really interesting one. This is what I call the working rich. You're stuck in the business because you treat money as a goal, but you have high financial discipline, but you can't escape that. And then in the top right corner, we've got high financial discipline and money as a resource, which is the strategic investor, knowing that the strategic investor has that high level of discipline, A, and then B, they are getting every dollar to compound, to continue to do some good work there.
I love I love this matrix because I think about the working rich box. And often you see quite a number of our folks who we work with in that box or up in the sort of cash poor entrepreneur who's just really trying to figure out how to survive, versus there's almost a little bit of a complacency that comes in the working rich. And it's hard to say it that way, but I think there's a little bit of complacency that comes in because it appears on the surface to be all good. One of the things I thought that was really interesting, I'm always looking for the steps or the simple things we can introduce to our clients. And one of the things we've got in the book is this idea of the levels of discipline that can help us move somebody in that working rich slowly but surely towards top right, or from top left to top right. Did you want to bring that to life with just 2 or 3 examples? But I think it's just a really great way of almost tying them to as a diagnostic to, or the symptoms to, those different classifications in the investor matrix.
Yeah, sure. So we've got the patient and we've got the high discipline and the money as a resource or money as a goal. So discipline versus the way that we think about money. So specifically what we're talking about here is high financial discipline. How do we move from low to high financial discipline? And that is, for example, moving from being a busy owner to working rich, or moving from a cash poor entrepreneur to being a strategic investor. So remember, as I just introduced this, that the impulsive risk takers pay compound interest, and the strategic executors, the people who are patient and disciplined, they earn compound interest. So in the context of discipline and the question that you asked, what we introduce is these 10 levels of financial discipline so that readers can look through these and say, where am I at and what do I need to move toward the next level? So I'll start at level 1, and to your question or to your comment, I'll only introduce a few. So at level 1, there's no budgets and there's no forecasting, and all financial data is historical. So our accountant tells us how we performed. We don't have any budgeting or forecasting. We just go out and do the stuff. And I think that many people are shocked to learn how many businesses just operate like that. I'll go to level 3 just to give you an idea of the level of ascension. And level 3, income reporting, not expenses, but income reporting is normalized at meetings. So you're often talking about sales performance weekly or maybe monthly. We kind of go up to level 6 then. Budget variance is normalized in reports and meetings. Budget variance meaning we were supposed to spend on flooring last month and we spent $42,500. So we're $500 over. Now, the types of things that are there and we are there, and we know what we're talking about and we know why it's important. Then we'll go up to say level 8, 1 or 2 KPIs are reported on weekly for each role or person. So that's pretty high up, right? But the KPI is something that's owned by someone in the business that no one else does. And we kind of think back to scorecards from the onboarded book. And then level 10, all spending and revenue budgets are consistently achieved. So just to pick a few out of there, it just gives you an idea of how we work to increase the level of discipline, financial discipline.
I think the thing that's important also when you read those levels is they compound. It's not you can pick 1, 3, 7, and 9 and you'll be good.
Yeah.
I think it's what I liked about the idea was that it illustrates this compounding set of decisions and disciplines that get you to a higher level of thinking about how you'll use money as a resource more effectively. And I think for me, that was just a really lovely little tool and checklist that we can work with our clients on, just to say, let's examine these things, because some of these things need to actually be true at each level before we can move on. They're not like we can skip and make it optional to go between 1 and 9, so to speak.
No. For example, level 9, there is an accurate 3-year cash-based rolling forecast. You can't do level 9 until you've done some of the preceding things. And then when you're really thinking about the discipline of level 10, like you said, that's when you apply that along with the money as a resource mindset, you can get to be this different level of investor.
And that is the work that we do with our clients every single quarter, where we present these 10 levels. And then we ask the question, where do we think we are? And what are the actions or the priorities to start going up the ladder? As you said, Richard, compounding, so we can build more discipline. However, there are owners who build the discipline and they're already very disciplined, and they might still chase money as a goal. And that will get them in that trap of the working rich. So, Brad, if you were to expand, what is that danger of owners getting stuck in there? Yeah, if you were to expand that, perhaps.
Yeah, well, the working rich have high financial discipline and they treat money as a goal, not money as a resource. So they're not considering every dollar as must compound. So again, $100 needs to turn in 120 over and over and over again. So that mindset is really quite different, and that's how people get stuck. So working rich is a real trap, and people find themselves, they've got the trappings, they've got maybe, a good car, they're having, some good holidays, perhaps, maybe a good house. They've got some of these trappings, maybe in a Perth context, even a good boat. But what they don't necessarily have is the ability to step back from that. And it's not necessarily about not working in the business as it might sound like at the beginning. It's much more a case of the way that money works in the business. So if you don't have the freedom to step out of the business, if you don't have that freedom, you are stuck continually working in that business. And that's a real problem that people can't get out of. And I think that, yes, you are rich, but don't have a depth. There's some fragility to it. Because if you say, all right, I'm going to have 6 months off, you're dependent on that because it's all been connected or working toward that goal.
Yeah, I think if there was ever an event, it's that idea that, you could have had a great business going into COVID, and then without the thinking and having some of the disciplines leading into that levels of maturity we just talked about, it could be just one bad year that kind of brings all of this tumbling down. Right. It's that's something we want to avoid. We want to plan for those things by having the systems in place and the discipline in place. I was listening to that as well, and I was thinking about the challenge that we often see with that, which is the top line is going up. And when I ask clients this, or people I'm meeting for the first time, tell about the business. They tell me about the revenue growth first. Always the revenue growth. And then I say to them, well, so how has gross margin been trending? Oh, that's been going up as well. And then you ask the third question, which is, so what's the net profit margin trend as well over the same time period? And there's this quizzical, sometimes resigned look when they realize that this idea that this growth without profit is really just a symptom of there being no strategy, right? This is the epitome of drift, right? It's the takeover of those two first numbers at the expense of understanding what the net profit of the business is. So if that's the case, that's my long-winded, somewhat intro to that. But why is that distinction of growth is not a strategy, profit is the strategy? Why is that so important to sort of land and have that resonate with owner-led companies?
Well, it starts with the famous Alan Milt's quote, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, cash is king. And that speaks really, it's nice, it's catchy, it speaks really well to what we're doing in and with our business. And then when we go back to the pressure for bigger, it's what we talk about societally. Often people don't talk about profit. They might say, oh yeah, we've enjoyed 20% growth this year or whatever that number is in a top line sense, but they wouldn't necessarily go out and tell people, yeah, I managed to take $750,000 cash out of the business and reinvest it. That's a bit more of a private conversation that, especially in Australia, is somewhat of a challenge for people to perhaps undertake. But it is the real purpose of the business, especially when we treat money as a resource and our job is to compound that. So it is this kind of disconnect. And then we come back to what is the purpose of strategy in a business? It's to build a unique and valuable position in the market. And that unique and valuable position in the market should be producing a better profit for the owners. That is why we do it, and you're not in a commoditized sort of sense. And it kind of goes back as well to the 15-15-15 concept that we spoke about before, and getting these flywheels, better team, better customers, better offering, to be turning so that we can actually achieve this in an ongoing sense.
So, of course, you mentioned these 3 flywheels, Brad, but you're not going to leave us hanging here. What is this flywheel for better financials?
Yeah. So we spoke about the doom loop, where it's an undisciplined investment. When we have high financial discipline, and we have money as a resource rather than money as a goal mindset, the better financials flywheel starts investing in better teams, customers, and offerings. So each of those 3 flywheels from before start with an investment at the top. And so we make that investment in the business. What happens when we do that is we maximize the results using the better teams, better customers, better offerings approach. So we get a better and compounding effort across those 3 areas. Consequentially, we generate superior business returns. And with those returns, we apply disciplined investment criteria. So we make sure that we're investing that well, using money as a resource mindset. And then comes the next part, which may form our next question, but it's very interesting. Once we've made that discipline criteria, then we reinvest our returns from the business, 1/3 into the business and 2/3 to lifestyle and external assets. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying it needs to be 33%, 33, but there needs to be 3 buckets, and every year or quarter, we need to make the decision. How much is going to be reinvested back into the business? How much is going to be reinvested to fund my lifestyle? And how much is going to be reinvested into external assets to grow my personal wealth?
I think, yes, you stole my question by reading ahead, but I think it's interesting, because when you bring this concept up of what does a business do in perfect flow, it's able to invest, it's able to fund a lifestyle, an improving lifestyle, and to accumulate assets for the owner outside of the business. And the third often gets immediate pushback. The point, though, was something you said there right towards the end, which was, it is the discipline to make decisions about those buckets in advance, to plan for those. Because I think when we see level 10 type financial discipline, I see owners we work with who have got to that point through hard work and compounding of effort. They start to make really good decisions about how much is going into the business and importantly, where it should go in the business, right? So is it team? Is it customer? Is it offering? And I think that is the real usefulness of that 1/3 model. Is it's a series of constraints to plan for and respond to, not to slavishly follow. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I was sitting in a meeting the other day. It's a business where I work with the leadership team, and we had the owner of the business and I'll say general manager / COO, the person who's effectively running the day-to-day moreover. And one of the questions that we always ask is, let's talk about cash flow. What's the state of cash flow? How's it working? And out of nowhere, cash flow had become quite a problem because the owner had come across an opportunity that they wanted to invest in that wasn't in the budget, and cash flow was a real and present problem that had the finance department, I won't say scrambling, but let's just say working harder than before. Now, sometimes opportunities arise, but to your point, Rich, when we have a money as a resource mindset, it's not that we can foresee those, but we think that at this point, the business can spin off cash. And that's when we're going to use, in a personal sense, that cash to say, how do we get that business money to work best outside of the business? Now, asterisks, like, take your own taxation advice, take your own accounting advice always. We're really speaking about the mindset of, don't get 20 years into the business and proudly say, I haven't taken $1 out of the business. And it enables you to build a better life by design, and that's what we want to do. So if you're running a business at 2, 3, 4, maybe 5% profit, instead of say 15% profit, which is the 15, 15, 15 stuff we've talked about before, well, that excess profit should be used to fund your lifestyle and build your personal wealth.
Yeah, that's a really important topic you mentioned, but I think you just brought home. Every flywheel that we've described so far starts with an investment. And that is the work that we do with owners, consistently working intentionally on, so what is the return on all of those decisions that we're going to be investing in, and keeping them at the same time, all consistent in the same consideration. But also, what are the impact or the expectation return on their lives, which is usually an element that is missing. But I don't want to spoil the surprise for the next week episode. But it is coming more and more common now than in every conversation that we're having. Every owner agrees that we need to consider all the flywheels in the same consideration, in the same level of investment. As you mentioned, Richard, when we invest either in a salesperson or operations person or a new product opportunity, what are the return expectations and how do we consider all of the elements at the same time?
Yeah, it's about mindset. Yes, there are tools in the book, but if we go back to the core principle about the problem with freedom is that we don't have these constraints, well, then, and that entrepreneurship doesn't do what it says on the tin. Well, we need to really think about, okay, how do we build a successful owner-led company that does what it says on the tin, that really builds a life? And I think that's what we're going to get into next week in the next episode. So any closing thoughts from you all about better financials?
For me, it's one word, it's compounding. Yes, you would want in any given period to have outstanding financials, but I'm more interested in what happens in the next period and the next period, because if that's consistent and compounding, it's that simple measure I often talk with founders about, which is return on invested capital, right? If you're getting 3-digit return on invested capital, you're doing something amazing and it's starting to compound. And why would you do anything else with this business other than to try and balance how you take the profits from this in terms of both the business, your lifestyle, and the assets outside of the business?
Probably for me, as a closing comment or closing word, following you, Richard, is sanity. Because it's about restoring financial clarity and control in a world where probably growth actually brings chaos. So it's not about the spreadsheets or the different numbers, but it's about creating a business where the numbers make sense, where the profit is intentional, and also where the owner sleeps at night knowing that the business works.
Lovely. Well, what a pleasure it's been to chat with you all today about better financials. As mentioned, I encourage you, if you haven't listened, to listen to the preceding episodes. And then next week, I hope you can join us for Better Life by Design. One of the things that happens, or that we can enable to happen once we get the business working. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy your week. Well, I hope that you enjoyed the episode. Please be sure to like and to subscribe for future episodes. And of course, this is part of the 7-part series releasing my new book, Bigger Isn't Better, Better is Better. Be sure to join in next week for the next episode.